May the force be with you and also with you. Hello, class. I am a little bit sad because last class I forgot to open up with the call and response. I forgot to open up with our ritual. I did remember to close the class with that, so at least all is not lost. But I remembered today, so thanks be to God. It's really good to see everyone. Today is Thursday, October 22nd, and it is great to see y'all. I'm going to set my timer. We're going to go for an hour today, and we are going to begin Descartes today. So hang on while I try to share my screen with you guys. I did do a PowerPoint, and someone very kindly thanked me for that, which was really cool. So today is our first lecture on Descartes. We are looking at this book. We'll come to that in a moment. We are going to say a few things about Aristotle as we leave Aristotle behind, but mainly we're doing Descartes today. The reason we're still talking a little bit about Aristotle is because I want you guys to see some very important connections between Aristotle on the one hand and Descartes on the other. They have a lot in common, despite the fact that Descartes, writing in the mid-17th century, aka the 1640s roughly, was doing his thing 2,000 years after Aristotle. The world has completely changed. We're going to talk about that a little bit. I wish that I could give a whole lecture on that, everything that happened culturally between Aristotle and Descartes, a 2,000-year span, basically. We don't have time for that. So all I'm going to say is that the big cultural development, the big cultural historical development that happened was the rise of Christianity, or the advent of the gospel. And when I say the gospel, I'm not assuming that you don't have to be a Christian to believe that the gospel is a historical event that happened that changed the world. And so the Christian church was launched, the Christian message went out into the world, and that happened in the midst of the Roman Empire. Eventually, the Roman Empire falls because the Caesar Constantine converts to Christianity in the 4th century. I want to say around 313 is whenever Constantine converted to the Christian faith. And then slowly but surely, the entire Roman Empire becomes Christian. You have the church fathers, people like Irenaeus and Ignatius and Saint Athanasius, who were hugely important in articulating the Christian view of reality. Then you have Saint Augustine, who's writing during the fall of the Roman Empire. When I say the fall of the Roman Empire, I really mean the old order of the Roman Empire. There's a sense in which the Roman Empire continued into the future. And that's true in two senses. Number one, the Roman Empire did not fall in the 4th century. In the East, in the Greek-speaking East, where the capital was Constantinople, the Roman Empire continued to survive for several more centuries. And even in the West, you have something called the Holy Roman Empire, which is different from the old order of the Roman Empire that had the Caesars and the emperors. It was different, and yet there's certain ways in which it was the same, okay? So you've got St. Augustine writing in the West during the fall or the collapse of the Roman Empire. And then after that, what you have is the emergence of a distinct Christian culture that most people refer to as the Middle Ages. I don't have time to talk about that phrase, the Middle Ages, but there were hugely important thinkers during that time, people like Saint Anselm, Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Bonaventure, and all of these people were standing on the shoulders of Saint Augustine, okay? Yeah. Super quick side note. One of the things that happens in the medieval world in the Latin-speaking West is the rediscovery of Aristotle. We have spent some time talking about Aristotle in this class, and in about the 12th century, that is the 1100s, Aristotle was rediscovered in the Latin-speaking West. He had basically been lost. That's an oversimplification in many ways. But in the 11th century, he was rediscovered. His works were translated into Latin, and that produced a huge renaissance in the Latin-speaking West. I don't have time to talk more about that, but let me just say that Descartes is writing at a time whenever certain shifts are definitely taking place, shifts that would mark the collapse or the decline of the Middle Ages and usher in a new cultural situation, which many people call the Enlightenment. You could also say the modern world or the modern period. Now, those terms, the Enlightenment and modernity, those are contested terms. Different scholars argue about exactly when the Enlightenment began, for example. In my mind, I usually say that it's really Descartes who ushers in the Enlightenment, or who begins the Enlightenment project, okay? Now, there's all sorts of ways, as we will see, that Descartes was still sort of the medieval man. By the way, we also don't have time to talk about the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. In other words, the 1500s, people like Calvin and Luther, but they're hugely influential. Descartes is writing after all of that. Descartes is Roman Catholic. He was educated at a Jesuit institution. And there's many, many ways in which Descartes is a medieval thinker. He's still thinking and making lots of assumptions that he would share with medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. All of that is true. And yet, what's also true is that he begins to usher in a new cultural and intellectual situation, which you could call Enlightenment. You could talk about modernity. You could talk in terms of secularization and the world, at least Western culture, beginning to become more secular, okay? So that's 5 or 6 minutes about things that happened between Aristotle in the 4th century before Christ, all the way up through the mid 17th century, the 1640s, in which Descartes is writing. Huge, huge transitions. What's amazing is that for all of their differences and for all of the differences of their cultural situation, Descartes and Aristotle still have a lot in common, and we will see that as we go, okay? Y'all, the first thing that we're gonna do is watch a little video. This is a video on method. We're gonna be talking about method. This is one of the ways that we are going to compare and contrast Aristotle and Descartes. But before that, I'm going to show you a video. One moment. Okay. I want to make it bigger. I really want to make it bigger. Okay, hang on one sec. Forgive me. All right. And here you go.
Let's explore the scientific method, which at first might seem a little bit intimidating, but when we walk through it, you'll see that it's actually almost a common sense way of looking at the world and making progress in our understanding of the world and feeling good about that progress of our understanding of the world. So let's just use a tangible example here, and we'll walk through what we could consider the steps of the scientific method. And you'll see different steps articulated in different ways, but they all boil down to the same thing. You observe something about reality, and you say, well, let me try to come up with a reason for why that observation happens, and then you try to test that explanation. It's very important that you come up with explanations that you can test, and then you can see if they're true, and then based on whether they're true, you keep iterating. If it's not true, you try to come up with another explanation. If it is true but it doesn't explain everything, well, once again, you try to explain more of it. So as a tangible example, let's say that you live in I don't know, northern Canada or something, and let's say you live near the beach, but there's also a pond near your house, and you notice that the pond tends to freeze over sooner in the winter than the ocean does. It does that faster, and it even does it at higher temperatures than when the ocean seems to freeze over. So you could view that as your observation. So the first step is you're making an observation. Observation. In our particular case, is that the pond freezes over at higher temperatures than the ocean does, and it freezes over sooner in the winter. Well, the next question that you might want to, or the next step you could view as a scientific method, it doesn't have to be this regimented, but this is a structured way of thinking about it, is, well, ask yourself a question. Ask a question. Why does, so in this particular question, or in this particular scenario, why does the pond tend to freeze over faster and at higher temperatures than the ocean does? Well, you then try to answer that question. And this is a key part of the scientific method, is what you do in this third step, is that you try to create an explanation. But what's key is that it is a testable explanation. So you create a testable explanation. And this is kind of the core, one of the core pillars of the scientific method. And this testable explanation is called your hypothesis. And so in this particular case, a testable explanation could be that, well, the ocean is made up of salt water, and this pond is fresh water. So your testable explanation could be salt water has lower freezing point, lower freezing point. So it takes colder temperatures to freeze it than fresh water. So this right over here, this would be a good hypothesis. It doesn't matter whether the hypothesis is actually true or not. We haven't actually run the experiment, but it's a good one because we can construct an experiment that tests this very well. Now, what would be an example of a bad hypothesis, or something that you couldn't even necessarily consider as part of the scientific method? Well, you could say that there is a fairy that blesses, that, let's say, that performs magic on the pond to freeze it faster. And the reason why this isn't so good is that this is not so testable, because it's depending on this fairy, and you don't know how to convince the fairy to try to do it again. You haven't seen the fairy, you haven't observed the fairy. It's not based on any observation. And so this one right over here, this would not be a good hypothesis for the scientific method. So we would want to rule that one out. So let's go back to our testable explanation, our hypothesis. Salt water has a lower freezing point than fresh water. Well, the next step would be to make a prediction based on that. And this is the part where we're really designing an experiment. So you could just view all of this as designing, let me do this in a different color, where we want to design an experiment. And in that experiment, let's say, and let's see, the next two steps I will put as part of this experimental, whoops, I messed up. I did my undo step. So the next part that I will do is the experiment. And There you go. So the first thing is, we'll say there's all sorts of things that are going on outside. The ocean has waves. Maybe there are boats going by that might potentially break up the ice. So I just want to isolate that one variable that I care about, whether something is salt water or not. And I want to control for everything else. So I want to control for whether there's waves or not, or whether there's wind or any other possible explanation for why the pond freezes over faster. So what I do in a very controlled environment, I take 2 cups. I take 2 cups. That's 1 cup and 2 cups. And I put water in those cups. I put water in those cups. And let's say I start with distilled water, but then this one stays, the first one right over here stays distilled. And distilled means that through evaporation, I've taken out all of the impurities of that water. And in the second one, I take that distilled water and I throw a bunch of salt in it. So this one is fresh, very fresh. In fact, far fresher than what you would find in a pond. It's distilled water. And then this is over here, this is salt water. So you wouldn't see the salt, but just for our visuals, you depict it. And then we would make a prediction. We'd make a prediction, and we could even view this as step 4, our prediction. We predict that the fresh water will freeze at a higher temperature than the salt water. So what prediction, let's say the fresh freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, but salt doesn't. Salt water doesn't. Salt water doesn't. So what you then do is that you test your prediction. So then you test it. And how would you test it? Well, you could have a very accurate freezer that is exactly at 0 degrees Celsius, and you put both of these cups into it. And you want to make sure that they're identical and everything, where you control for everything else. You control for the surface area, you control for the material of the glass, you control for how much water there is, but then you test it. And then you see what happened from your test. You leave it in overnight. And if you see that the fresh water has frozen over, so it's frozen over, but the salt water hasn't, well, then that seems to validate your testable explanation that salt water has a lower freezing point than fresh water. And if it didn't freeze, well, it's like, okay, well, then maybe or if there isn't a difference, maybe either both of them didn't freeze or both of them did freeze, then you might say, well, okay, that wasn't a good explanation. I have to find another explanation for why the ocean seems to freeze at a lower temperature. Or you might say, well, that's part of the explanation, but that by itself doesn't explain it. Or you might now want to ask even further questions. Well, when does salt water freeze? And what else is dependent on? Do the waves have an impact? Does the wind have an impact? And so then you can go into the process of iterating and refining. So you would then refine, and iterate on the process. When I'm talking about iterate, you're doing it over again, but then based on the things that you've learned. And so you might come up with a more refined testable explanation, or you might come up with more experiments that could get you a better understanding of the difference between fresh and salt water. Or you might try to come up with experiments for what is it about the salt that makes this water harder to freeze? So that's essentially the essence of the scientific method. And I want to emphasize, this isn't some, bizarre thing. This is logical reasoning. Make a testable explanation for something that you're observing in the world, and then you test it and you see if your explanation seems to hold up based on the data from your test. And then whether or not it holds up, you then keep going and you keep refining and you keep learning more about the world. And the reason why this is better than just saying, oh, well, look, okay, I see the pond is frozen over, the ocean hasn't, it must be the salt water, and I just feel good about that, is that you can't feel good about that. There's a million different reasons, and you shouldn't just go on your gut, because at some point your gut might be right 90% of the time, but that 10% that is wrong, you're going to be passing on knowledge or assumptions about the world that aren't true, and then other people are going to build on that, and then all of our knowledge is going to be built on kind of a shaky foundation. And so the scientific method ensures that our foundation is strong. And I'll leave you with the gentleman who's often considered to be the father or one of the fathers of the scientific method. He lived in Cairo and in what is now Iraq, nearly 1,000 or roughly 1,000 years ago. And he was a famous astronomer and physicist and mathematician. And his quote is a pretty powerful one because I think it even stands today. The duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, let me start over just so I get the dramatic effect right. The duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. Hassan ibn al-Haytham, and his Latinized name is Al-Hazan. So he's saying be skeptical, and not just skeptical of what other people write and read, but even of yourself. And another aspect of the scientific method, which is super important, is if someone says they made a hypothesis and they tested and they got a result, in order for that to be a good test, and in order for that to be a good hypothesis, that experiment has to be reproducible. Someone can't say, oh, it was only a certain time that only happens once every 100 years, and not that's why it happened that day. It has to be reproducible. And reproducible is key, because then another skeptical scientist like yourself could say, let me see if I can reproduce it. Let me not just believe it because that person looks like they're smart and they said that it is true.
Excellent.
Let's explore.
Okay, y'all. That was a very good video, I might add. And isn't it amazing? This Muslim thinker who is a thinker in the Middle Ages, is actually channeling the spirit of Descartes. But he lived much prior, many years, maybe centuries before Descartes. But that's a good example of how Descartes was sort of a man of his time. Okay, we will come back to that in a moment. What I want to do next is just a little bit of review from last time. And these are just things that we talked about in our last lecture on Tuesday, October 20th, Tuesday, October 20th. These are just things that we already discussed. I'm going to go through them very clearly, very quickly. First off, we talked about dirt clods and triangles. Y'all remember that? This is about Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, which is bracketed on both sides, bookended, if you will, on both sides by prime matter on the one hand and pure form on the other. But what we've said is that all of the other things in the world. And what is Descartes' special phrase for things? He doesn't say things, and he doesn't even say objects. Object is a word that Descartes will use, but Aristotle doesn't say object. He says composite units of form and matter. Composite units of form and matter, okay? And so everything else in the world, aka all of the things in the world, aka all of the composite unities of form and matter, fall between those two extremes, between prime matter on the one hand and pure form on the other. And we talked about two classes of things in the middle, two classes of composite unities of form and matter, two special cases in between the two extremes. And on the one hand, we talked about dirt clods, which is the way I'm alluding to the four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. And what we said about those is that they're top heavy with respect to matter. They're heavy on matter and light on form. In fact, they're almost like prime matter, because while prime matter has no form at all, the four elements, earth, wind, fire, water, dirt clods, admit of a very minimal level of form. They have almost no form at all, and yet they do have a little bit of form. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to distinguish dirt from fire. And can you distinguish dirt from fire? Yes, you can. That means that they have a little bit of form, okay? So that's dirt clods. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, closer to pure form, in fact, almost pure form, we have mathematical entities, aka numbers, aka geometric shapes, by which I'm referring to with the word triangle, okay? And what's the point about triangles? The point about triangles and other geometric shapes is that even though they are separable from matter, they are inseparable from matter in reality, which is to say that you've never seen an immaterial triangle. Every single triangle you've ever seen is composed of some sort of matter, maybe brass, maybe wood, maybe chalk on a chalkboard, maybe pixels on a computer screen. Every single geometric shape and triangle that you've ever seen in reality is inseparable from matter. On the other hand, triangles are not inseparable from matter. That is to say, they are separable from matter. That is to say, they are immaterial in thought, not in reality, but in thought. What does that mean in thought? Well, that means that the essential definition of a triangle does not include any mention of matter at all. AKA, if you look up triangle in our philosophically airtight dictionary, you can read that definition 1,000 times, and you're never going to read anything about wood or brass. Wood and brass is not essential to the definition of triangle. In fact, materiality, matter, is not essential to the definition of a triangle, which is to say that a triangle is separable from matter in thought, not in reality, but in thought. And y'all, that's kind of crazy, because if you look at natural entities like frogs and giraffes, they are inseparable from matter, both in reality and in thought. And if you go up to the top of that hierarchy that we talked about last time and consider spiritual entities like angels, like God, like the soul, the human soul, those are separable from matter, both in reality and in thought. So there's something special about numbers. Numbers and geometric shapes are a very interesting phenomenon. They're philosophically significant. And if you think about it long enough, what you begin to realize is that they're heavy on form and light on matter. They're top heavy with form. They admit of form in a very high degree, but there's something about numbers that is independent of materiality, and so they're very unique and interesting in that sense. Okay, and so that's the first point of review from last time. And look, I did A and B. I did A and B because when I was talking about triangles, I also reviewed that excursus that we had on number, that is to say, Aristotle's hierarchy of entities, with spiritual entities at the top, mathematical entities in the middle, and natural entities like frogs and giraffes at the bottom. Okay, look with me at C on this review page. What are Aristotle's names for God? There's three. One of them is super simple because it's just the Greek word for God, which is theos, Theos. And it's actually not th in Greek, it's a theta. But you've got theos, and then you have the prime mover, or you could say the unmoved mover. And then thirdly, what is Aristotle's other word for God, his other title for God? It is thought thinking itself. And that's hugely important, thought thinking itself. Already we can see that Aristotle's God, even though it has so much in common with the way Parmenides describes being in terms of all of those negations, aka its simplicity, nevertheless, it's different from Parmenides' God because from Parmenides' being, because Aristotle's God is not simply static. Parmenides never says that being thinks, much less does Parmenides ever say that being thinks about itself or thinks itself. No, Parmenides doesn't talk that way, and yet Aristotle does. There's something about Aristotle's God which, for all of its similarities to Parmenidean being, it's not static. There's a principle of dynamism in Aristotle's God. And what is that dynamism? It is reflexivity, thought thinking itself. In this situation, thought is neither simply the subject nor the object, but it's both. It's like a dog chasing its tail. Or it's like a snake eating itself. This is one of the things that I usually use to get the idea of reflexivity across. I hope you can see this. I think you can. A snake eating itself. You can see how the snake is both the eater and the eatee. He's both doing the eating as the subject of the action, and he's being eaten as the object of the action. So in this case, the snake is both active and passive, both subject and object. This is a reflexive activity that's going on when the snake eats itself. And if I say that I bathe myself, or in Spanish, se rompió mi teléfono se rompió. It got broke on itself. It broke itself. It's both the subject and the object. That's called the reflexive voice. It's not active or passive, it's reflexive. And in a reflexive activity, the subject is the object, okay? If I say Matt is looking at the cup, Matt is the subject who's performing the action. The cup is the object, it's receiving the action. If I say that Matt drinks the tea, Matt is the subject, tea is the object. Matt is performing the activity, doing the action. The tea is receiving the action. It is the object, okay? But in a reflexive situation, the subject and object are the same. And so what I'm wanting to emphasize to you is that for Aristotle's God, there's a reflexivity here such that the subject is the object, okay? Just by way of review from last time, I don't have my book, The Metaphysics, with me, but I've held it up many times for you to see. That book, Metaphysics, Aristotle did not call it The Metaphysics. It's not like he gave it that title. We've talked about how it received that title, having to do with the arrangement of books on a bookshelf. But there are two ways in which Aristotle does refer to that body of knowledge. He calls it theologia, aka theology, and he calls it first philosophy. Okay, we're going to come back to this notion of first philosophy very soon, but that is our review from last time. Okay, y'all, as we turn our attention in a more full way to Descartes, first, I just want to say a few things about the text that we are reading. And let me say once again, do stay on top of the reading schedule. We're gonna be in Descartes for 2 weeks. This is our first of 2 weeks to be in Descartes. We might, if we need to spill over into a third week, that's no problem at all. I have packed that kind of margin into our schedule. But we're going to try to have 2 weeks on Descartes. And so today is after today, we'll be halfway through. Stay on top of your reading. The first thing I want to say is that in this book, in this volume, which I think most of you purchased, there are actually 2 works of Descartes. You've got the Discourse on Method and the Meditations on First Philosophy. Now, those 2 texts are very similar in many ways. But we're only reading the second one. We're only reading the Meditations on First Philosophy. One of the, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But look with me at A on your outline here. What I want to say is, y'all, you're probably going to have a quiz next week, maybe the week after that on Descartes, maybe on Thursday. I'm going to plan on giving you the quiz on Thursday. But as I've said in the past, one of the questions on the quiz will be from your reading, and you're in luck because this text is eminently skimmable. Why is that the case? Well, it's the case for a couple of reasons. Let me just cut to the chase and say, I would encourage you to read the dedicatory letter, which begins to those most wise and distinguished men, the dean and doctors of the Faculty of Sacred Theology of Paris. I would encourage you to read that, the letter of dedication. I would also encourage you to read the preface to the reader immediately after that. But then I would also encourage you especially to read the synopsis on the following 6 meditations. In other words, Descartes has given us something kind of like cliff notes, to the entire Meditations on First Philosophy. It's called the synopsis, and I would definitely encourage you to read that. If you read nothing else, do read that. The other thing that I would encourage you to read is the title. It's a long title, but do not neglect to read the title of the work that's right after the synopsis. And then finally, you'll notice that each of these 6 meditations, I think that there's 6 meditations. We're not going to read them all, but each of the 6 meditations has a title. And I would definitely encourage you to read those titles, particularly of the meditations that I did assign you on the reading schedule. Okay. So unlike other things that we've read, for example, unlike Plato's Dialogues, it's possible to skim the meditations, largely because Descartes gives us a really cool synopsis and also titles that have a lot of content. Okay. So that's a word about your reading. Look with me at number B, the audience of this work that Descartes wrote to. The main thing that I have in mind here is the dedicatory letter. Which is written to theologians, okay? Again, the title of the dedicatory letter is to the most wise and distinguished men, the dean and doctors of the Faculty of Sacred Theology at Paris. Y'all, that right there is very interesting. And here we see both a radical difference between Descartes' historical situation on the one hand versus that of Plato and Aristotle on the other. Now, what's interesting is that Plato and Aristotle also talk about theology, as we just said, right? I mean, look with me at E, what's one of the ways in which Descartes refers to his work, the Metaphysics? He calls it theology. So it's not like Plato and Aristotle don't talk about theology, as we've seen time and time again in this course, but the theologians that Descartes are writing to are Christian theologians. They are theologians who are working within the Christian tradition. In other words, they believe that Jesus is both God and man. They believe in the New Testament scriptures. They're Christians, okay? And so that's super, super important. Descartes is writing in a Christian situation. He's writing to Christians as a Christian. Again, he was educated in a Jesuit institution, okay? So that is a word about audience. The point about audience is that Descartes is writing to a Christian audience, a group of theologians, and he's writing in a Christian milieu or a Christian context, okay? The last thing I want to say, letter C on here, in terms of a general introductory comment on Descartes' text, is that the Meditations was written in Latin. That's probably because he's writing to these theologians at Paris, and they would have been reading in Latin, writing in Latin, probably even speaking in Latin. But what I want to say is that the first book in the first text in this volume, which we're not reading, called the Discourse on Method, which is very similar to the Meditations. They're very similar, but the discourse is written in French. So Descartes writes both in the vernacular, that is to say French, but also in the language of formal scholarship, namely Latin, okay? And in this way, Descartes is like Dante. Dante wrote in Latin and in Italian, and also John Calvin. John Calvin wrote in French and in Latin, okay? So So this is one of the things that happens toward the end of the Middle Ages and at the beginning of the modern period, especially during the Enlightenment, is you have people writing in both Latin and the vernacular, okay? And as an example of this French versus Latin issue, these two languages, look with me at A and B under letter C. Because y'all look with me at, oops, I'm going to change that. Hang on real quick. All right. I think I can save. Yeah, okay. Look with me under C. Look with me at C2. You can see that in the Meditations, Descartes says something really interesting and really important. Cogito ergo sum. Cogito ergo sum. We're going to talk about this over and over again. What cogito ergo sum means is I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. This is often just called the cogito, as I have just written on the PowerPoint. The cogito. When we say the cogito, that's shorthand for this statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, okay? That's how Descartes says it in the Meditations, because it's written in Latin. And for those of you who speak Spanish, you can see that Latin looks a lot like Spanish, right? But look with me at number 1 under letter C in the Discourse on Method, which is written in French, in which we're not reading for this class. He says the same thing, cogito ergo sum, except that he says it in French, je pense donc je suis, okay? That means the same thing, I think, therefore I am, but this is a hugely important statement. If you didn't learn anything else from Descartes, what I would want you to know is I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. In the Discourse written in French, he says, je pense donc je suis, okay? Good. And so those are some introductory comments, mainly about the text that we're reading in Descartes. What I want to do next, and I'm going to talk for about 15, 20 more minutes. We're probably not going to get through this. That's fine. I do want you to stay up on your reading. What I want to do now is continue to develop 5 big themes in Descartes. And the first one is this idea of first philosophy. And just the basic bottom line point is that both Aristotle and Descartes talk about first philosophy, because first philosophy, in addition to theology, is one of the ways in which Aristotle describes his project or the content of that book called the Metaphysics, First Philosophy. But then look, Descartes also uses the phrase first philosophy because this text that we're reading is called the Meditations on First Philosophy. Y'all, that's a really big deal. What is this business about first philosophy? Well, okay. This is where I really wish I could write on a chalkboard. Or really wish that I had more time to make really cool slides or pictures, diagrams for you guys. But let me put it like this. Do you remember in Descartes how we talked about, in Aristotle, how we talked about his order of learning? And we talked about logic, then physics, Fuchsius, nature, then what? Metaphysics, right? So we talked about how Aristotle has a particular order of learning. Logic, then physics, then metaphysics. Why do I put physics in quotes, by the way? It's because that's really the study of nature. It's not what you and I think about when we think of physics, like string theory or atoms or torque. No. Physics in an ancient context is about nature, what Plato would call the realm of becoming, the realm of generation and corruption, plants growing, plants decaying. That's physics. And the point right now is that as we saw, Aristotle has an order of learning. He talks about if you want to be a philosopher, if you want to achieve wisdom, then the first thing you do is you need to study logic. You cannot move up without studying logic. Logic is like the most fundamental prerequisite for achieving knowledge. Okay, in a modern context, we might want to say for mastering science. Okay, so in Aristotle, you have logic and then physics and then metaphysics. Now, y'all, here's what I want to say. If I were to ask you, think about those three branches of knowledge: logic, physics, and then metaphysics. If I were to ask you which of those is first, what would you say? Now, some of you would probably want to say logic, right? Because that's the thing that you study first, and that's not wrong. But check this out. That word first can have multiple meanings, okay? Because, yeah, I mean, like, if you think about learning to walk, first you have to crawl, right? A baby has to crawl before it learns how to walk, right? And so we say you got to crawl before you walk. And it's true that crawling comes first. It's true that crawling is first, but that's only one sense of that word first. The word first, or prime, the word prime, can have other meanings as well, right? So for example, think about the phrase "the first lady." If you talk about the first lady of the United States, does that mean that, like, she was the first lady who ever existed? No. What does it mean? It means she was the most important. See, prime or first can also mean the most important. And I thought of another example as well. We could talk about prime numbers, but I think even a better example would be prime rib. Prime rib is the best kind of steak that you can get, I think. Prime rib isn't like the first steak that ever existed or that you've ever eaten. No, it's the best. And so if we talk about something being prime, it's the best. And if we talk about something being first, like the first lady of the United States, in a sense, she's also the best, or at least the supreme, okay? So you see, first can mean either the first in a sequence, it can mean sequential priority, or it could mean priority of meaning or priority of importance, right? I hope that you can see this point. Whenever we talk about first philosophy, we're not talking about logic here. Yes, logic is first in sequence, but it's not the first in priority or the first in importance. The first in importance is metaphysics, okay? Oops. Okay, good. The first in importance is metaphysics. And so you see, metaphysics for Aristotle is first philosophy, not because it comes first, but because it's the most important. Now, I want to give you another way in which for Aristotle, metaphysics is most important, or another sense in which metaphysics is first philosophy, okay? And it's this. It's true that metaphysics comes last in the sequence. It comes after logic. It comes after physics. Those are prerequisites to metaphysics. That's true. But y'all, in another sense, what Aristotle would want to say is that it's metaphysics that grounds the entire system, okay? In other words, if you never made it to metaphysics, you could never be sure that the entire system coheres. Put it a different way. In order for the entire system to cohere, you have to grasp the whole, okay? And you're not going to grasp the whole without metaphysics. And in fact, metaphysics, in a way, is the whole, because metaphysics talks about God. Put it a different way, it's almost as if what Aristotle would say is that if we didn't have metaphysics, we could never be sure of physics. If it weren't for metaphysics, we could never be sure that we really understood physics properly. if it weren't for metaphysics, we could never be sure that we were competent in our grasp of physics, aka the realm of nature. Okay, and the same is true for logic even. So you see, metaphysics for Aristotle is super important. It's not just the most important, but it's also the ultimate, and it grounds the entire system. Okay, and y'all, something similar is true for Descartes when he talks about first philosophy. You see, Descartes does mean something different by first philosophy than Aristotle does, but it's also very, very similar because Descartes also thinks that it's first philosophy, and we haven't even talked about what first philosophy is for him yet. But he would agree with Aristotle that it is first philosophy that grounds the system. And the way that Descartes would put it is like this: without first philosophy, we could not have certainty. And what Descartes wants to say, and this is super important, and by the way, this is different from Aristotle in a way, because Aristotle does not insist on certainty in the way that Descartes does. But what Descartes wants to say is that it is first philosophy which gives us certainty, and it is precisely that certainty which grounds knowledge, or grounds the entire system of knowledge, or you could put it like this: grounds the sciences. See, if you think about logic and physics and metaphysics, you can see that as you can talk about that as the sciences, or the organized body of knowledge that people hold or affirm or believe in. And y'all, when we talk about Aristotle's logic, physics, and metaphysics, that's kind of like in our day and age talking about first you learn chemistry, then you learn biology, then you learn physics, modern physics, right? And a lot of people say, sorry, I think I got that wrong. It might be, oh yeah, sorry. It's biology, then chemistry, and then physics. First you study biology, then you study chemistry, then you study physics. And what many people would say in our day is that actually biology reduces down to chemistry, and chemistry reduces down to physics. We don't have time to talk about all that right now, but the important point is that there are separate disciplines like logic, physics, metaphysics, or like chemistry, biology, and physics. And the point is that each of these disciplines is connected, interconnected, to form a larger system of sciences. And it is first philosophy that grounds the entire system. And that is true for both Aristotle and Descartes. Okay, so that's a little bit on first philosophy. We're going to come back to this over and over again as we talk about Descartes. Let's jump to number B, letter B. And y'all, I'm going to look at my timer. I have about 5 minutes left. This might be the last thing that we have time to discuss. What I'm going to try to do is draw some diagrams of these concepts and put them up for you next time. We'll see if I have time to do that. But that's a little bit about first philosophy. Okay, look with me at B. B is very related to this notion of first philosophy and the way that each discipline in the sciences is interconnected. B is similar to that, although it's also different. Descartes and Aristotle's method for discovery. Now, y'all, we watched at the beginning of this class a video on the scientific method. There's a reason I showed you that video. What that video talks about is a method of discovery, a method for discovery that modern people like you and me are very, very familiar with, right? I mean, I can remember learning the scientific method when I was in junior high and then high school, and probably you can say the same thing. It's very, very common. But that is a particular method of discovery. It involves observation, asking questions, testing an explanation, or coming up with a hypothesis and then testing it. 4, you design an experiment, which involves predictions. And then 5, you run the experiment. And then 6, basically you repeat and refine. Okay. So that's the scientific method. There might be different ways of talking about it, but that's what that video was about. And we're all familiar with that. Well, Aristotle has a different method. Okay. And I'm going to write it down. I'm going to write it down. Aristotle has a different method. And here's what it is. And you can just memorize this. I do want you to understand it, but you could also just memorize it, okay? Aristotle's method is start with the most familiar to you, then move to what is most, oh wait, sorry, start with the most knowable to you, then move to what is most knowable in itself. Now, y'all, that's kind of weird, and we're gonna talk about it. But here's Aristotle's method for discovery. Start with what's most knowable to you, and that usually is what's most familiar to you. You start with that, and then you move to what is most knowable in itself. Now, that whole business about knowable in itself, that's weird. You probably have no idea what that's about. Let me give you a little hint. It's connected to reflexivity and thought thinking itself. But you start with what's knowable to you, and then you move out and build on that to other things that are not as knowable or familiar or immediately apparent to you, toward things that are most knowable in themselves. We're going to talk about that, but you should memorize that. That is Aristotle's method for discovery. Now, Descartes has a different method, and I'm just going to write it. Descartes. Doubt. Find something indubitable. And y'all, this phrase right here, clear and distinct ideas, is super important. Super important. Dang it. Okay, we'll do this. We'll do this. A, doubt. B, find something indubitable, clear and distinct ideas. C, build more knowledge. I'm going to say, I'm just going to say build more knowledge on that foundation of certainty. Build more knowledge on that foundation of certainty. Build more knowledge on that foundation of certainty. Y'all, that's Descartes' method. You start out with doubting. We're going to talk more about this. In fact, it's letter C right here. Systematic doubt. Descartes wants to say, don't believe anything unless you can be certain of it. Descartes wants to say, don't believe that God exists just because your Sunday school teacher told you. You need to be certain of something before you can believe in it. And how do you become certain of something? Clear and distinct ideas. We'll talk more about that. Then once you find a clear and distinct idea, then you finally have a solid foundation on which to build other knowledge. But you cannot build other knowledge without a solid foundation of certainty on which to build, okay? And y'all, I think I'm going to close right there. We will talk more about this stuff next week. Have a wonderful weekend. I do want to say real quick, just a quick housekeeping note. I did respond to many of your emails. Some of y'all sent me outlines and rough drafts and paper topics. I responded to all of that, probably maybe on Friday of last week. Some of you have sent me more things, and I should be able to get to those today. Tomorrow. That's Thursday. Sorry. Yeah, I should be able to get to those on Thursday or Friday of this week. Okay. So thanks for all that. Please keep in touch. You can text me, you can call me, you can email me. Okay. Very good. May the force be with you and also with you. Have a great weekend.